For centuries, travelers and scholars have admired the stone theaters, marble statues, and heroic legends of ancient Greece. But behind these monuments lies a much deeper story. Greece did not arise overnight as a land of philosophers and city-states. It formed over millennia under the influence of shifting trade routes, external forces, and changing empires. The first known Greek cultures emerged on islands and coastal plains, thriving on maritime trade and skilled craftsmanship. Later, civilizations on the mainland inherited their knowledge, built fortified palaces, formed alliances, and waged wars that became epic legends. After a period of decline, communities recovered and developed new forms of self-government, giving rise to the polis, a model that changed the face of the ancient world. At the same time, art, architecture, and literature flourished, from the mysterious labyrinths of Crete to epic poems of heroic deeds, from the smoke of battles to the foundations of democracy. This is the story of how the Greeks laid many of the cultural and intellectual pillars that we still stand on today. We will begin with one of the earliest and most intriguing chapters, the Minoan Civilization on the island of Crete. The island of Crete, located at the crossroads of eastern Mediterranean trade routes, was the cradle of one of Europe's earliest advanced civilizations, the Minoan Civilization, whose heyday was around 1400 BC. The Minoans left behind impressive palaces, vibrant works of art, and evidence of a sophisticated seafaring culture. Much of what we know about them comes from early 20th century excavations by Sir Arthur Evans at Knossos. Buried under layers of earth, he uncovered a vast palace complex with administrative halls, grand reception rooms, extensive storage magazines, and ritual chambers connected by labyrinthine corridors. Evans named this civilization after the legendary King Minos, but it is still not clear how political power was organized in Minoan society. Key Minoan centers included Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, each with a palace at its core. These palaces seem to have served simultaneously as the residences of rulers or nobles, centers of economic administration, and places for religious ceremonies. In their magazines, archaeologists found large clay pethoi, jars for grain, oil, and wine. The carefully recorded inventories suggest centralized administration, although no direct written records of their government have survived. The Minoans used Cretan hieroglyphs and linear A writing, which remains undeciphered. Archaeological finds nonetheless indicate a well-organized society with craft specialization, long-distance trade networks, and large-scale building projects. Thanks to its favorable location, Crete played an important role in maritime trade. Ships sailed from its ports to Egypt, the Levant, and across the Aegean. The Minoans exported pottery, timber, textiles, and possibly metals, and brought back cultural influences from Egypt, the Near East, and the Cyclades. Artifacts found on Crete display Egyptian, Near Eastern, and Cycladic artistic elements. Minoan pottery was sought even in distant lands. Active exchange of goods and ideas throughout the Eastern Mediterranean helped spread new artistic motifs and probably religious rituals. The Minoans were also renowned for high-quality painting. Frescoes on the walls of their palaces show graceful figures engaged in sports or ritual activities. Famous scenes of bull leaping may reflect a religious rite or demonstrations of bravery. Another popular theme was the sea. Vases were adorned with octopuses, fish, and shells. These lively patterns highlight the Minoans' strong connection to the sea and their admiration for the natural beauty of Crete. Minoan religious beliefs remain largely mysterious, but it is clear that women often held positions of spiritual authority. For example, the famous snake goddess figurines, women in elaborate dresses holding snakes, may indicate a fertility cult or connections to the underworld. Open mountaintops in Crete, such as Ida, served as community worship sites. There, the Minoans offered sacrifices of animals or dedicated clay figurines. The legendary bull held central significance in Minoan iconography, underscoring its sacred status. Although we don't know the details of their mythology, Minoan religious practice was likely closely tied to nature's cycles and fertility, possibly centered on a mother goddess figure. The Minoans developed their own writing systems, but Linear A is still undeciphered. Archaeologists have found many clay tablets and seals with these scripts recording economic accounts, inventories of grain, oil, labor, and tribute. Unfortunately, the language of these records remains a mystery. This language barrier makes it hard to understand Minoan politics and law in depth. Nevertheless, the very existence of writing indicates a high level of social development. Palace administrators kept track of goods and distributed resources directly from the palaces. Crete was also prone to geological disasters. In 1628 BC, a massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, sent tsunamis across the Mediterranean and a plume of ash into the sky. It is not clear how severely this affected the Minoans. Some scholars believe the eruption undermined Crete's economy, while others note that several more decades passed before the palaces ceased to function. Major earthquakes likely worsened the damage, and the Minoans repeatedly rebuilt their settlements. Between 1500 and 1450 BC, the Cretan palaces underwent a series of destructive events, probably major fires, invasions, or internal conflicts. Most palaces were destroyed, and only Knossos survived. However, shortly after this, Knossos began to show influences from foreign powers. Clay tablets with Linear B, the script used on the mainland, started to appear. It seems that mainland Greeks gradually absorbed or replaced the Minoan elite and adopted much of Cretan culture. By around 1400 BC, the Minoan civilization had largely given way to Mycenaean dominance on Crete. Despite its fall, the Minoan legacy proved enduring. The Mycenaeans adopted Minoan architectural techniques in their palaces. Crete's sea trade routes continued to link the Aegean and the Near East, and Minoan artistic motifs, especially the vivid marine decorations, influenced mainland Greek pottery. The legendary labyrinth and bull cult even found reflection in the later myth of the Minotaur. Archaeological finds, like the partially restored palace at Knossos, testify to the high level of Minoan culture and continue to capture the imagination. Today, the Minoans are seen as an independent, advanced civilization with a complex social structure, maritime ambitions, and a refined artistic tradition, not merely a background for the Mycenaeans. Mycenaean Civilization. While the Minoans ruled Crete, a parallel process was taking place on the Greek mainland. Around 1600 BC, the Mycenaean civilization gained strength on the Balkans. It was named after its most famous site, Mycenae, the name also given to its ruling dynasty in historical sources. The Mycenaeans built powerful fortified citadels on hilltops, leaving behind massive walls and legendary artifacts that amazed contemporaries in later generations. Key centers were Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Athens. In contrast to the labyrinthine palaces of Crete, Mycenaean palaces looked like true fortresses. A typical Mycenaean palace included a megaron, a rectangular hall with a hearth in the center and columns supporting the roof. This hall served as the king's main reception chamber. The king is called Wanax in Linear B tablets. Around the megaron were storerooms, workshops, and administrative offices. All of this was surrounded by high walls of huge stone blocks, hence the term Cyclopean masonry. Later Greeks believed only Cyclopes, giants of legend, could have moved such boulders. Like on Crete, scribes in Mycenaean palaces kept detailed records of the household on clay tablets, but using a new script, Linear B, inherited from Cretan writing but adapted to the Greek language. These texts, deciphered only in the mid-20th century, mention rations for soldiers, lists of chariots and supplies, bronze, wool, etc. They give insight into how the Mycenaeans managed resources, taxes, and possibly trade. Besides administrative records, some tablets detail the mobilization of troops and provisions, hinting at frequent military activity or threats of raids. In general, Mycenaean culture was much more warlike than the Minoan. This is seen in the burials of Mycenaean nobles. In the shaft graves at Mycenae, archaeologists found golden royal masks, lavish jewelry, and weapons inlaid with scenes of battles or hunts. Excavators like Heinrich Schliemann, the famed discoverer of Troy, were stunned by these riches, though modern historians still debate whether the finds at Mycenae should be linked to the biblical Agamemnon. In any case, the skill and wealth of these tombs show that Mycenaean kings wielded enormous power and resources. Mycenaean trade networks reached far beyond the Aegean. Mycenaean pottery has been found on Cyprus, in the Levant, and possibly in Egypt. In exchange, the Greeks acquired precious metals, timber, and exotic goods from those regions. In art, the Mycenaeans borrowed some Minoan motifs, but adapted them to their own tastes. Frescoes often depicted processions of warriors or hunting scenes, emphasizing martial valor and the noble warrior class. Luxurious chariots, mentioned in both archaeological record and texts, became symbols of aristocratic status. If the Minoans celebrated bull leaping, the Mycenaeans focused on heroic themes involving arms. The world of the Mycenaean age provided the backdrop for many later Greek myths, especially those related to the Trojan War. According to legend, a coalition of Mycenaean kings besieged Troy, a city on the northwest coast of Asia Minor. In Homer's Iliad, this conflict is described as a struggle for personal honor with the intervention of the gods. Archaeological excavations at the Hisarlik Mound in Turkey do show destruction layers roughly contemporary with the supposed time of Troy, although there is still no definitive proof of a single great battle. Nevertheless, the Mycenaeans clearly could assemble large fleets. Ancient accounts mention transport ships with tens of thousands of rowers and conduct active campaigns by sea and land. The concept of long-distance expeditions was very much alive for them. By the end of the Mycenaean period, around the 12th to 11th centuries BC, New Greeks, the Achaeans, the name used in the Iliad for Agamemnon's Greeks, fully took control of Crete. However, soon great changes followed. Around 1200 BC, the civilizations of the entire eastern Mediterranean experienced a catastrophe. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Raids by the so-called Sea Peoples swept the western regions, and Mycenaean palaces underwent cycles of destruction. Many historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. For Greece, it meant the end of the palace era. The script Linear B vanished, administrative systems collapsed, and trade routes were disrupted for decades. Most Mycenaean palaces were burned or abandoned, people resettled in more defensible valleys and mountains, and the complex state structures fell apart. Despite the fall of the centers, the memory of the Mycenaeans was preserved in oral tradition. Tales of great kings, golden masks, and impregnable citadels were passed down from generation to generation. Over time, these epic stories were woven into Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, preserving the memory of a heroic age of battles and gods. In the centuries that followed, the simple farming communities that replaced the Bronze Age elites still cherished the legends of the vanished era. Archaeological remains, the Lion Gate at Mycenae, and the Cyclopean walls of Tiryns became symbols of this recent greatness. Already in the classical era, scholars visited these ruins and pondered their origin, reinforcing the sense of a heroic past that shaped Greek identity. Today, the Mycenaean world is seen as a complex Bronze Age civilization with palace administration, advanced craft production, especially jewelry making, and strong martial traditions. The Minoans are remembered for their seafaring mastery and refined frescoes, while the Mycenaeans left us a legacy of monumental fortifications and a heroic spirit. Together, they laid the foundations of cultural achievements that prepared Greece to become a world of city-states, polis, ready for the ages to come. Greek Dark Ages. By the beginning of the 11th century BC, when the great palaces of Mycenae and Tiryns lay in ruins, Greece passed through a long period of social simplification, often called the Greek Dark Ages. This term can be misleading. It generally describes a noticeable decline. The population fell, large-scale building projects and long-distance trade stopped. The palace economies disappeared, replaced by much more local and smaller communities. With the fall of the palaces, the bureaucracy based on linear B collapsed. Without centralized authority, literacy became irrelevant, and writing practically vanished. Most goods were produced and exchanged at the village or family level. The pottery style of this time, called proto-geometric or geometric, became noticeably simpler in decoration. Vessels were adorned with linear patterns, meanders, spirals, and zigzags instead of complex narrative scenes. Modest household items have been found in graves, reflecting a society with limited authority and fewer imported luxury goods. In some regions, local chieftains emerged, but their power was significantly weaker than the old palace kings. Massive fortifications were no longer built, and there were no pan-Greek architectural projects. References to Dorian invasions in this era are largely mythological. It's unclear how many northern tribes actually contributed to the collapse or arrived afterward. In any case, the Greek world had been reduced to a tapestry of farming communities that preserved only fragments of the Bronze Age memory. However, knowledge and identity were passed down orally. Bards, aoidoi, composed and performed epic songs about the deeds of heroes from the past, even though their tales were not yet written down. They brought stories of Mycenaean warriors, sieges, and palaces to their audiences. It was from such oral traditions that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey would later emerge. Although details changed with each telling, the very concept of a heroic age continued to live on in Greek minds. Communities were built around kinship ties. Individual families united into clans, clans into villages, and gradually defined the boundaries of their lands. Ancestor or hero cults likely emerged. People worshipped mythical forebears at simple altars and shrines. New technologies provided important support, especially the advent of ironworking. Iron tools and swords were stronger and more accessible than bronze ones, which made farming easier and allowed more effective defense against neighbors. By the late 9th to early 8th century BC, signs of revival appeared. Pottery styles became more sophisticated. Established geometric patterns with meanders, circles, and zigzags dominated. In some graves, archaeologists note an increase in richly equipped burials, indicating a partial return of prosperity. Agricultural surpluses allowed the population to grow and helped re-establish trade links, albeit more modest than in Mycenaean times. One of the most important innovations was the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet, with some modifications for the Greek language. This transformed writing, allowing speech to be recorded far more flexibly than with the old syllabic systems. By the 8th century BC, Greeks were inscribing alphabetic letters on pottery and stone stelae, marking the revival of literacy and official record-keeping. As villages grew, new forms of self-government took shape. Communities on remote hills or at good harbors could expand their influence. This set the stage for the appearance of the polis, the city-state, united with its surrounding countryside. Each polis had its own authorities, religious festivals, laws, and armies, which fostered a strong local identity. At the center of most polis were the agora, the marketplace and public meeting area, and the Acropolis, a fortified hill with temples to the city's patron gods. By the 9th-8th centuries BC, the groundwork was laid for a Greek Renaissance. Even in the Dark Ages, the seeds of major changes had been sown. The fall of palace rule allowed small communities to experiment with governance, and the oral epics preserved memories of shared heroes. The spread of iron and the return of writing prepared the soil for rapid innovations. Thus, the Dark Ages became an important bridge between the Bronze Age past and the blossoming of city-states that began in the Archaic era. Archaic Period. From the mid-8th century BC, the Greek world began a rapid revival. This era, approximately 800–500 BC, is called the Archaic Period. It was then that the foundations of classical Greece were laid. Independent city-states, poleis, took on clear forms of organization. Greek culture spread beyond the Aegean Sea. A powerful wave of colonization led to new Greek settlements in southern Italy and Sicily, the so-called Magna Graecia, along the coast of Thrace and the Black Sea, and even westward as far as the area of modern-day Marseille. Opportunities in trade expanded. Greek goods, especially pottery with geometric designs and later black figure decoration, became popular exports. In return, the Greeks imported metals, timber, and other valuable resources from Egypt, Phoenicia, and the Black Sea regions. At the same time, internal changes accelerated. New political institutions formed in the cities, and art and literature began an unprecedented flowering. One of the key achievements of the Archaic Period was the emergence of the polis, an autonomous community with a city center and surrounding territory. Each polis developed its own laws, religious traditions, and systems of governance. In most cities, the center was the agora, the marketplace and citizens' assembly, and the Acropolis, a fortified hill with temples and shrines. A strong sense of local identity and pride took root. Initially, power was held by wealthy families. In different polii, rule belonged to the aristocracy. Members of noble clans shared key offices among themselves using tribal and kinship ties. However, as trade developed and the number of prosperous merchants and small landowners grew, tensions arose. Non-aristocratic people, farmers, artisans, and traders demanded greater political participation. These conflicts gradually led to social reforms. Meanwhile, the economy diversified. Agriculture expanded, possibly thanks to the introduction of iron tools replacing bronze ones. Trade ties in the Mediterranean became more active. The Greeks formed maritime leagues and alliances through which their goods spread across the seas, while imported wealth flowed into their ports. By the end of the 7th century BC, colonization was in full swing. Faced with population growth and the need to provide for new people, many polias sent out colonies to distant lands. From Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and other cities, expeditions sailed and founded new cities in Spain, along the Black Sea coast, Asia Minor, and beyond. When establishing a colony, they sent a supreme leader, an oikist, who brought the sacred fire from the mother city to sanctify the new hearth. Although colonies became politically independent, cultural ties with the mother city remained. The new communities carried the Greek language, customs, and myths into local contexts. Within the polei, social tensions mounted. Aristocratic rule caused dissatisfaction, and in several cities, power fell to tyrants, individuals who seized control by force or popular support. It is important to note that at this time, the word tyrant did not always have a negative connotation. Many tyrants enjoyed support from the masses who wanted to curb the power of the aristocracy. Often, these tyrants undertook public works, building temples, walls, and monuments, and organized great festivals and athletic contests. For example, in Corinth, the tyrant Cypselus promoted the growth of trade and the large-scale construction of a new port. Sparta stood apart, a polis in the southern Peloponnese that chose a different path. Even before the Archaic Period, the Spartans had subdued neighboring Messenia, turning its people into helots, state-owned serfs. Sparta became a rigid military oligarchy. According to legend, the lawgiver Lycurgus established a strict social system. All Spartan citizens were equal under the law, though only male citizens had full status. And children were raised from an early age in a communal system called the Agoge, a harsh training camp that taught military skills, discipline, and absolute loyalty to the city. Sparta had 2 hereditary kings, a council of elders, and 5 ephors who checked the king's power. This was not a democracy. Personal freedom was limited for Spartan men. but the army was held in the highest regard. Sparta became a fearsome land power, though it did not engage much in sea power or colonization. The Archaic Period also brought a cultural renaissance to Greece. In the 8th–7th centuries BC, the oral epic traditions were finally written down. The Homeric epics Iliad and Odyssey, woven from oral tales, were recorded, passing the myths of Troy and Odysseus into classical literature. Other poets put their wisdom into verse. Hesiod wrote the Theogony and Works and Days, telling of the gods and giving practical advice to farmers. In many parts of Greece, lyric poetry flourished, performed to music. Sappho on the island of Lesbos wrote poignant odes about love and inner emotions. Alcaeus and Anacreon celebrated heroism, wine, and victory. Thus, poetry became a means of both public reflection and personal expression. Art underwent noticeable changes. Potters moved away from purely geometric patterns to narrative scenes. In the 7th century BC, Corinth gave rise to black figure vase painters, black figures on a red background, and later Athens adopted this style. Vases began to depict heroes from myths, mythological scenes, everyday life, and athletic contests. In the 6th century BC, the red figure technique emerged, red figures on a black background, allowing a more detailed depiction of the human form. At the same time, sculptors began making life-size statues of youths and maidens, kouroi, naked young men, and chorai, clothed young women. The earliest works looked stiff and symmetrical, but by the end of the Archaic Period, they had learned to portray more natural anatomy and movement. Pan-Hellenic festivals and religious rituals played a unifying role. The Olympic Games were held regularly at Olympia, festivals in honor of Zeus that gathered athletes from all over the Greek world. Victors in the Games returned home as heroes. Another powerful center was Delphi, the sacred site of Apollo. Both ordinary people and city delegations traveled to the Delphic oracle to seek the advice of the gods. These rituals and festivals reminded Greeks of their common bonds, even when their cities were at odds. In this way, the Archaic era prepared Greece for its classical flowering. On the ruins of the palaces grew cities with new political forms, art, science, and philosophy. Persian Wars. By the late 6th century BC, the Greek city-states were prospering, but remained politically divided. Meanwhile, a new empire was rising in the east, the Persian Empire. Founded by Cyrus the Great and expanded to colossal size by Cambyses and Darius IV, it stretched from the Indus Valley to the coast of Asia Minor. The clash between the freedom-loving Greek poleis and this Eastern Empire sparked a series of wars that became some of the most famous in antiquity. First, the Persians conquered neighboring territories. Around 546 BC, they defeated Lydia in Asia Minor, bringing Ionia, the Greek cities on its western coast, under Persian rule. The wealthy Ionian cities fell under Persian governors, satraps, although they had no common unity. In 499 BC, the Ionians, led by Miletus, revolted against the Persians, securing a small measure of help from Athens and Eretria. They even managed to seize and burn the Persian stronghold of Sardis. But by 494 BC, the uprising was crushed. Miletus was destroyed and Persian authority was restored. King Darius. I was enraged by Athens and Eretria for their part in the revolt and decided to punish them by moving into Europe. In 490 BC, he sent a fleet across the Aegean Sea. The Persian force captured islands off the Greek coast and conquered Eretria, an ally of Athens, then landed on the plain of Marathon, about 40 kilometers northeast of Athens. An Athenian army, reinforced by soldiers from Plataea, marched out to meet the numerically superior Persians on that plain. Despite the inequality in numbers, Athenian hoplites, heavily armed infantry, under the general Miltiades, struck a decisive blow. The Athenians suddenly charged and enveloped the Persian flank. The Persians broke and fled back to their ships. This unexpected victory stunned the Greeks. Lightly armed hoplites had stopped a mighty empire. The name Marathon became a symbol of pride and courage, celebrated in song. However, the Athenians did not become complacent. They began preparing for another attack. Themistocles, their leading general, insisted on strengthening the navy. In the meantime, Darius died, 486 BC, and his son Xerxes Tharnes took up the cause. Amassing a vast army and fleet, Xerxes in 480 BC marched into Greece. Soldiers from all corners of the Persian Empire joined his banners, and pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, allowed his forces to cross into Europe. A portion of the Greeks united to face this threat. Sparta took charge of land defense and Athens of naval defense. The first major battle took place at Thermopylae. In a narrow mountain pass, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas held off the Persian army for several days. In the end, the Persians discovered a hidden path and outflanked the Spartans. Leonidas and his men, knowing there was no hope of survival, fought to the last and were all killed. Their heroic stand gave the Greek alliance precious time to mobilize. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet was fighting the Greek navy off Artemisium, north of Euboea. Though these engagements were hard fought, after a series of clashes, the Greek fleet withdrew to the Saronic Gulf near Athens. Meanwhile, the Persian army marched into Attica and captured Athens, which had been evacuated by its citizens. The remaining Greek forces concentrated at Salamis, the narrow strait off Athens. There, Themistocles won a critical naval victory. He lured the heavier Persian ships into the confined strait where the lighter Greek triremes could maneuver more effectively. In the ensuing battle, the Greek ships inflicted heavy losses on the Persians. Many Persian vessels were sunk, and the remnants fled. The victory at Salamis preserved Greek naval power and dealt a severe blow to Xerxes. He feared for his supply lines and withdrew the bulk of his army, leaving only a small Persian detachment under Mardonius to continue the campaign. In the spring of 479 BC, the remnants of the Persian army advanced into central Greece. The Greek coalition, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, gathered at Plataea. After a short maneuver, the Greek hoplites confronted the Persians in battle. The experience and endurance of the Greek infantry proved decisive. Mardonius was killed, and the Persian army fell into confusion. At the same time, the Greek fleet attacked the Persians at Mycale in Asia Minor, destroying or capturing many ships and inspiring the Ionian cities to revolt. These twin victories at Plataea and Mycale secured Greek freedom from Persian rule. Persia no longer controlled the mainland, and Greek ships once again dominated the Aegean Sea. The Greco-Persian Wars entered history as a great example of smaller cities resisting an Asian imperial onslaught. The victories gave the Greeks a surge of pride. The Athenians particularly remembered Salamis. It showed that Athenian democracy had underwritten the success. The rowers in the battle were themselves citizen soldiers. The Spartans were heartened by Plataea. They believed their strict military discipline had proven its superiority. In general, the idea of a pan-Hellenic community was strengthened, but the spirit of rivalry also sharpened. Due to their success, Athens soon formed its own naval alliance, and Sparta felt threatened by Athens's growing power. Thus was laid the foundation for new conflicts that would soon erupt into civil war. Peloponnesian War. By the early 5th century BC, the Greek world was split into two rival camps. At sea, Athens led its Delian League of maritime states, focused on naval power, tribute, and trade. While on land, Sparta headed the Peloponnesian League, including Corinth, Thebes, and others, relying on its powerful infantry. Not long before, they had united to repel the Persians, but old grievances and political ambitions soon shattered their unity. In 431 BC, open conflict broke out, the Peloponnesian War, which, with intermittent truces, lasted about 27 years. The immediate cause was a web of disputes over influence and several local conflicts. Athens had involved itself in the affairs of Corinth and its colonies, for example, Corcyra and Potidaea, which enraged Corinth. Corinth appealed to Sparta with accusations of treaty violations. Fearing Athens's growing power, the Spartan assembly decided to go to war. Pericles, the Athenian leader, ordered the people to avoid open land battles. He instructed the city's inhabitants to take refuge behind the walls of Athens and rely on the navy to supply the city through its port. This began the first phase of the war, 431–421 BC. Spartan king Archidamus II repeatedly ravaged the lands of Attica, burning fields and crops, but the Athenians, protected by their walls, were unable to engage him in the open. Meanwhile, the Athenian fleet raided the coasts of the Peloponnese. This war of attrition soon reached a stalemate, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. In 430–429 BC, a terrible plague struck besieged Athens. The overcrowding, shortages of food, and unsanitary conditions led to an epidemic, likely typhus or a similar disease, that claimed thousands of lives. Pericles himself died from the illness. The catastrophe shattered the Athenian spirit. Many began to blame the government's strategy. Nevertheless, Athens did not lose hope. By 425 BC, the demagogue Cleon had rallied the people and led the Athenians in an attack on Spartan hoplites on the island of Sphacteria near Pylos. There they captured hundreds of Spartan soldiers, a serious blow to Sparta's pride and its invincible army. In 421 BC, the Peace of Nicias was concluded. Emotions cooled, but underlying tensions remained. Allies on both sides, for example Thebes and Corinth with Sparta, Argos with Athens, pursued their own goals and local conflicts continued. In Sparta there was growing discomfort that its dominance was fading without war, while Athens still harbored ambitions. A new turning point came with the Sicilian expedition of 415–413 BC. Athens decided to launch the largest force in its history, an expedition of tens of thousands of hoplites and hundreds of ships to help the city of Segesta in Sicily against Syracuse, a Spartan ally. After much debate, the fleet set sail. Alas for Athens, the campaign in Sicily turned into a disaster. The leaders quarreled. One of the commanders, Alcibiades, was accused of sacrilege and fled to Sparta, leaving the Athenians under the command of Nicias and Lamachus. The Syracusans fortified their city and appealed to Sparta for help. The Athenian army became trapped in a protracted siege. Attempts to send reinforcements all failed. By 413 BC, the entire huge Athenian expedition in Sicily was either annihilated or captured. The survivors, according to some accounts, were sent into slavery. This catastrophe seriously shook Athens. They lost hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, and most damagingly, their confidence in their naval superiority. Sparta seized the moment. It fortified the stronghold of Deceleia in Attica, only 20 kilometers from Athens. From that point on, Spartan raiding parties constantly ravaged the outskirts of the capital. Athens lost more crops and some of its population faced starvation. The Athenian demos fell into a deep morale crisis. By this time, Sparta's most capable admiral, Lysander, rose to prominence. He skillfully played the diplomatic game. He forged an alliance with Persia. In exchange for the promise of recovering the Ionian cities, "We will take our towns back or else," Persia provided gold to finance a new Spartan fleet. With Persian funding, the Spartans built up their navy and gradually eroded Athens' once unquestioned naval supremacy. Nevertheless, the Athenians continued to resist. They rebuilt part of their fleet and occasionally won sea battles. But resources were running low, recruitment was difficult, funds were exhausted, and social discontent grew. In 401 BC, the dire economic situation and internal political strife led to a coup. The aristocratic party imposed an oligarchy of the 400 in Athens, hoping to negotiate peace with Sparta on better terms. However, the Athenian fleet stationed at Samos refused to recognize the new regime and remain loyal to democracy. Within months, the democratic leaders regained control of Athens. A final, fatal blow came at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC. Lysander delivered a crushing defeat to the Athenian fleet in the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, capturing almost all their ships. Athens lost its last fleet and was effectively blockaded, doomed to starvation. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. Sparta tore down Athens' long walls, which had connected the city to its port, dissolved the Delian League, and installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy in the city, the 30 Tyrants. Sparta had become the undisputed leader of Hellas. The Peloponnesian War shook the Greek world. It left thousands dead, fields burned, and homes ravaged. Neither Athens nor Sparta retained its former power. The pride and unity born of the struggle with Persia gave way to bitterness of defeat and war weariness. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through these events and wrote a history of the war, saw it primarily as a manifestation of human passions, fear, lust for power, and political miscalculation, rather than any divine plan. His work became a classic of political thought, deeply analyzing the ideals of democracy, the realities of power, and the moral dilemmas of wartime. Unfortunately, the weakened and divided Poles were unable to resist a new force that would soon arise in the north, Macedonia. 4th century BC. With Athens fallen and Sparta briefly ascendant at the end of the Peloponnesian War, Greek history entered a new era. Sparta was hegemon for a short time, but in the 4th century BC, its power began to waver. This was a complex age of shifting alliances and internal conflicts, with each polis seeking its own advantage. Sparta attempted to install pro-Spartan governments, pro-Peloponnesian oligarchies, in its former allies, including in Athens. The rule of the 30 tyrants was quickly overthrown in 403 BC. However, Spartan intervention bred resentment. Its garrisons and governors were costly to maintain and left people unable to govern themselves. Attempts to tighten control over the Ionian cities again led to confrontation with Persia. Within Sparta itself, the harsh military system and the small number of full citizens made it difficult to manage the alliance of Greek states. Social tension grew, helots escaped, and ruling the widespread territory became almost impossible. Sparta's army remained the best on land, but it had no naval supremacy. Frequent revolts exposed the weak points of its hegemony. Unexpectedly, Thebes in Boeotia rose to prominence. Long in the shadows of the great Polis, the Thebans seized upon the general discontent with Spartan rule. Their generals, Pelopidas, and especially the gifted Epaminondas, reformed the army. In 371 BC at the Battle of Leuctra, the Thebans delivered a crushing defeat to Sparta. Epaminondas used innovative tactics. He rearranged his troops into an oblique formation, placed the elite Theban sacred band at the front, and broke the previously invincible Spartan phalanx. This defeat shocked the entire Greek world and shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. After their victory, the Thebans liberated Messenia from Spartan control, a region that had been Sparta's breadbasket, and its liberation further undermined Spartan power. The Thebans created a new Boeotian League of cities, expanding their influence in central Greece. Epaminondas even twice led campaigns into the Peloponnese, threatening the city of Sparta itself. However, Theban success was short-lived. In 362 BC, Epaminondas was killed at the Battle of Mantinea, and without him, Theban unity faltered. Meanwhile, a new power was rising to the north. In Athens, democracy was restored. The instigators of the 30 tyrants were overthrown, but the Athenian Empire was gone. Athens looked economically and politically weakened. Nevertheless, it retained its fleet and some influence at sea, forming new maritime leagues. Its former allies still paid tribute and sent ships. The memory of former glory lived on thanks to the speeches of great orators, Demosthenes, Isocrates, and others, who in their works alternately lamented past glory and called for national unity. Athens was no longer the superpower of the 5th century, but culturally it remained a beacon. It was during this period that famous schools of rhetoric, philosophy, and science arose there, attracting students from all over the Hellenistic world. As the fortunes of the polis rose and fell, to the north, Macedonia was gaining strength. Previously, the Macedonians had been seen as somewhat backward neighbors of the Greeks. Their monarchy controlled scattered tribal lands, and they only occasionally went to war or traded with the Greek cities. For example, King Alexander III had supported the Athenians in battles against the Persians. A threat from Macedonia seemed too distant. Everything changed when Philip II, 359–336 BC, came to power. The young Philip had been sent as a hostage to Thebes, where he saw Epaminondas' military successes firsthand. Once king, he carried out sweeping army reforms. He introduced the Macedonian phalanx with long pikes called sarissas, which could strike the enemy from deep ranks. In addition, Philip created an elite cavalry force, the Companion Cavalry. First, Philip secured Macedonia's northern borders. He made treaties with neighboring tribes or crushed threats from Illyrians and Thracians. Then, he turned his attention to the internal conflicts of the Greek city-states. Flexible diplomacy, dynastic marriages, and military demonstrations allowed him to establish alliances with Thessaly and gradually intervene in the affairs of central Greece. One significant victory was the capture of the city of Amphipolis, Philip's strategic stronghold in the Chalcidice region. Philip presented himself as a protector of Delphi. He obtained favorable rulings for himself at the Amphictyonic Council, which gave him moral legitimacy for his interventions. The Greek cities long ignored Macedonia's rapid rise, each absorbed in its own rivalries and not perceiving a unified threat. Only by 338 BC, when Macedonian troops already threatened the very heart of Hellas, did Athens and Thebes hurriedly form an alliance. At the Battle of Chaeronea, the Greeks faced Philip's army. Despite fierce resistance from the Athenian and Theban forces, the Macedonians defeated them. This defeat marked the end of the era of the autonomous city-state and the beginning of a new age, the age of Macedonian hegemony and its successors, who would soon reshape the entire Greek world. Alexander the Great. In 336 BC, the young king Alexander succeeded to the throne of Macedonia. In just 10 years, his armies conquered an empire stretching from Greece through Egypt and deep into Asia. Alexander's brilliant campaigns and the integration of his conquered lands set the foundations of the Hellenistic era, but his legacy also brought challenges. His personal ambition showed how fragile an empire based on one man's genius could be. After Philip's assassination, many Greek cities tried to regain independence. Alexander swiftly suppressed a Theban revolt, brutally razing the city as a warning to others, and secured his control over mainland Greece. In 334 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia with about 35,000 troops. He visited Troy, honoring the memory of Homeric heroes as a way to connect his campaign with Greece's heroic past. The first major battle occurred at the Granicus River, where local Persian governors attempted to stop the Macedonians. Despite nearly losing his life in the fight, Alexander defeated the Persians, opening the way into Western Asia Minor. The Greek cities of Ionia, long under Persian control, greeted Alexander as a liberator. He abolished tyranny there and allowed the cities to join his Corinthian League, although he installed garrisons for security. By the winter of 334–333 BC, Alexander held the key satrapies of Asia Minor. Persian king Darius III, taken by surprise, began preparing an army for a decisive confrontation. In late 333 BC, Alexander's and Darius's armies met on the plain of Issus near modern Adana. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander's disciplined phalanx and cavalry maneuvers overcame the Persian host. Alexander personally led a cavalry charge against Darius's position, and the Persian king fled the battlefield, abandoning his royal standard. With Darius gone, the Persian army crumbled. Darius's family, his mother, wife, and daughters, fell into Alexander's hands. Alexander spared them and treated them with respect, reinforcing his image as a noble conqueror rather than a mere plunderer. After this victory, Alexander turned south toward Syria and Asia Minor. In the winter of 332 BC, he engaged Darius again at Gaugamela. Despite the enormous Persian forces, including war elephants and scythed chariots, the disciplined Macedonian phalanx and deft cavalry tactics once again prevailed. Darius fled again, and his army collapsed. Alexander captured Babylon, Persepolis, and Susa, the great capitals of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was set ablaze, symbolically marking the end of Achaemenid rule. Darius himself escaped eastward, but in 330 BC was murdered by one of his own governors, Bessus, who wanted to continue the resistance. Alexander then proclaimed himself the rightful successor to Darius. Having crushed the remaining Persian satraps, Alexander pressed on to the eastern provinces. In 327 BC, he conquered Bactria and Sogdiana, roughly modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. There, he faced fierce resistance from local tribes. The rugged terrain and guerrilla tactics prolonged the campaign for years. Despite the difficulties, Alexander laid siege to mountain fortresses, established garrisons, and even married local noblewomen to secure loyalty from the conquered peoples. Over time, he adopted a policy of cultural integration. Several thousand Persians were enrolled in the Macedonian army and administration, and Alexander himself began wearing Persian dress and even required his companions to perform proskynesis, prostration, before him as a semi-divine king. This move angered many of his Macedonian officers. For example, the general Philotas was executed after being implicated in a conspiracy against the king. The mixing of different peoples, the cult of Alexander as the son of Zeus, and mass intermarriages of his soldiers gave the new state a Eurasian character. In 324 BC, Alexander organized mass weddings at Susa, where he himself married a Persian princess. In 327 BC, Alexander's army crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains into the Indus Valley. There, the Greeks were halted by King Porus of India, and in the Battle of the Hydaspes, 326 BC, Alexander won a hard-fought victory. Exhausted by the long campaign and facing the monsoon ahead, the Macedonian soldiers refused to march further east toward the Ganges. Alexander realized his army was ready to advance no more. After this victory, the army turned south, but the return journey proved catastrophic. Alexander's troops crossed the Gedrosian Desert, modern Balochistan, where many perished from thirst and hunger. All this time, Alexander continued to organize his vast empire. He minted coins in all the conquered lands, founded new cities with Greek populations, complete with civic organizations, and moved troops around to establish new satrapies. He intended further campaigns, perhaps into Arabia, but fate would not allow them. In 323 BC, Alexander unexpectedly died in Babylon at only 32 years of age. The cause of his death is still unknown. Ancient sources mention fever or poison, while modern theories suggest malaria or typhoid. Alexander left no adult heir. His son Alexander IV was born after the king's death, and his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, was mentally unfit to rule. This led to a power struggle among his generals, the Diadochi. Within a few decades, Alexander's empire splintered into separate kingdoms. In the east, the Seleucid dynasty, descendants of Seleucus, came to control Asia and Syria. In Egypt, the Alexandrian Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by Ptolemy, and in Macedonia and Greece, the Antigonid dynasty ruled. Thus was born the Hellenistic Age, when the Greek language and culture spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Asia. Hellenistic Period. After Alexander's death, his generals could not agree on how to rule his inheritance. Instead, several powerful Hellenistic kingdoms arose, 330 BC. In Egypt, the Ptolemies, Ptolemy I, Soter, and his descendants ruled. In Asia, the Seleucids, founded by Seleucus III Nicator. In Macedonia and Greece, the Antigonids, descendants of Antigonus the Rheon. In Asia, Minor and beyond existed the Attalid kingdom, centered in Pergamon, and some polis managed to keep their independence. The Greek city-states tried to preserve their autonomy, but all were now in the shadow of royal courts. The pan-Hellenic city-state was no longer the main actor in politics. Power had shifted to royal palaces and standing armies. Nevertheless, the Hellenistic era became a time of great flowering of Greek culture. The Greek language and the name Hellenes became the universal language of administration, trade, and science. Local elites in various regions readily adopted Greek customs, often blending them with their own traditions. The most important cities of the new era were built or rebuilt on Greek models. For example, Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander, and Greek settlements along the Bosporus featured agoras, theaters, and gymnasia. Everywhere, temples appeared that combined classical Greek architectural orders with local styles. This facilitated cultural blending. A resident of Alexandria might worship the Syrian god Serapis, a syncretic form of Osiris with traits of Zeus, and at the same time study at a Platonic school. In this period, a true spread of Greek ideas to the east took place. Huge libraries and research institutes, museums, were founded in cities like Alexandria and Pergamon, centers of scholarship. Scholars, building on Greek traditions, advanced mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine. Among them were famous figures. Euclid developed systematic geometry, elements. Archimedes of Syracuse made discoveries in hydrostatics and mechanics. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth and created a map of the world with meridians and parallels. This scientific activity did not occur in Athens, but drawing on Platonic and Aristotelian traditions, it bubbled in the cosmopolitan Hellenistic metropolises. Philosophy, too, transformed. In the Hellenistic period, new schools of thought emerged to meet the needs of the age. Stoicism, founder Zeno of Citium, c. 300 BC, taught that the world is governed by reason, logos, and that people should live according to nature, with self-control and virtue, not carried away by passions. Epicureanism, Epicurus 341–270 BC, held that the highest good is pleasure, understood as the absence of physical pain and mental anxiety. A simple life and friendship, they taught, brought peace of mind and freed people from the fear of gods and death. The skeptics, Pyrrho of Elis and his followers, doubted the possibility of attaining true certainty and therefore advocated suspending judgment in order to achieve mental tranquility. The Cynics, Antisthenes and Diogenes of Sinope, rejected social conventions and wealth, preaching a life in harmony with nature and disdain for luxury. These teachings appealed to city dwellers troubled by the crisis of the polis, promising people calm and self-control regardless of historical upheavals. Later on, Stoicism especially resonated with Roman elites, who found in its ideas the fortitude to face the dangers of power. Meanwhile, in Athens, the old academy and lyceum continued in new forms, preserving Platonic and Aristotelian traditions. Orators like Demosthenes and Isocrates promoted rhetoric as the art of persuasion, while scientists pursued mathematics and astronomy. Thanks to Hellenistic centers, Greek knowledge spread worldwide. These texts were translated into Latin and later became treasures for Arab scholars. Ultimately, Greek philosophy became the foundation of world thought. Its methods, dialectic and logic, laid the groundwork for scientific inquiry, and its ideas about reason and virtue continue to influence moral systems and educational curricula to this day. The Greeks were the first to demonstrate that humans are capable of thoughtful reasoning about the world, and their philosophy became an enduring heritage of civilization. Roman conquest. By the 2nd century BC, Rome had emerged onto the Mediterranean stage. After defeating Carthage in the Punic Wars, 149–146 BC, and subduing neighboring tribes in Italy and the Balkans, Rome became the dominant power on the western edge of the Greek world. Meanwhile, The East remained fractured among warring Hellenistic kingdoms. Individual Greek cities, for example Corinth, turned to the Romans, hoping for support against their neighbors. Thus, lacking a common Greek strategy, Rome was gradually drawn into the affairs of Greece and the East. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Roman legions had triumphed over Macedonia and the Seleucids and were establishing dominance over the Aegean. Specifically, in 214–205 BC, the First Macedonian War with Philip V ended inconclusively, but gave Rome experience beyond Italy. In 200–197 BC, the Romans, led by Titus Quinctius Flamininus, won a decisive victory at Cynocephali over Philip V, who had allied with Hannibal and threatened Greek hegemony. The Roman triumphant, Flamininus, proclaimed the freedom of the Greek cities from Macedonian control. At the same time, Philip V's successor Perseus tried to restore his kingdom's former glory. But in 171–168 BC, the Third Macedonian War brought Rome a crushing victory. In the Battle of Pydna, 168 BC, the Roman legions shattered Perseus's phalanxes. Rome then formally divided Macedonia into 4 regions, turning it into a semi-dependent republic. Sparta by then was a mere hollow of its former self. In that same year, 168 BC, Rome took Corinth, utterly destroying the city and killing or enslaving most of its inhabitants. Thus, by the late 3rd century BC, the political independence of the Greek city-states had effectively ended. Rome established control through proconsuls and governors, although some local self-government by citizens was still permitted. In the 4th–3rd centuries BC, Greece had been the stage for new wars of Hellenistic kings, for example, Antigonus, Ptolemies, Seleucids, Attalids, and uprisings of local leaders. But by the end of the 3rd century, it became clear that Rome was a powerful new superpower. In 197 BC, Rome made an alliance with the strangely independent Epirot kingdom, which found itself involved in Macedonian affairs. By 133 BC, the last Hellenistic kingdom, Ptolemaic Egypt, passed to Rome by inheritance. And in 30 BC, the Roman Emperor Octavian, Augustus, after defeating the warlord Cleopatra VII, took control of Egypt, the last of the Greek realms. Thus, the eastern lands of Greece and the emerging Byzantium became part of the Roman Empire. The transition to Roman rule did not happen all at once or without resistance, but by about the 1st century AD, Rome already fully controlled Greece. The poleis kept their names and forms of government, internal democracies or oligarchies, but all became provinces of Rome. At the same time, a cultural synthesis took place. The Romans adopted much from the Greeks. Roman religion had already partly built its pantheon on the Greek model: Zeus, Jupiter, Aphrodite, Venus, etc. Athenian philosophers and scholars influenced the Roman elite. Many Roman authors wrote in Greek or quoted Greek thinkers. It is important to emphasize, Hellenism was not defeated by the Romans. On the contrary, the Greek cultural current continued to flow into the Roman Empire. Greek traditions formed the basis for early Christian theology and later the Western Renaissance. Roman poets, Virgil and Ovid, adapted Greek myths, preserving them for centuries. Roman philosophers, for example, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, wrote in the Greek style. In this way, Greek culture passed on through time and space, becoming an integral part of Western civilization. Conclusion. From the palaces of Crete to the cities of the classical age, ancient Greece shaped political systems, arts, and ideas that still matter today. Its inventions, the polis, democratic debate, dramatic theater, and systematic philosophy, spread across the Mediterranean during the Hellenistic Age and were later absorbed by Rome. Greek science, literature, and visual arts set standards that echoed through centuries of Western culture. Their legacy continues to influence how we think, create, and govern, making ancient Greece a lasting source of inspiration.